This is a true story of the strangest unit in World War II, 1,000 men who went to war armed with nothing but paintbrushes, inflatable tanks, and sound effects. In the summer of 1944, while Allied forces bled across Europe, a secret unit called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops staged entire fake armies just miles from the front lines. They fooled German scouts with rubber weapons that weighed less than 100 pounds but looked like 40-ton tanks. They blasted recordings of engine noise and bridge crossings through speakers so powerful they could be heard miles away. And they saved thousands of lives, not by fighting, but by making the enemy believe an army existed, where there was almost nothing at all. What you're about to hear is the story of the Ghost Army, artists and ad men who turned deception into a weapon and silence into their shield for over 50 years. An army of the unlikely. In early 1944, the U.S. Army did something extraordinary. It recruited an entire unit based not on physical strength or marksmanship, but on creativity. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially a headquarters unit, unofficially the Ghost Army, was assembled from art students, advertising designers, radio engineers, and sound technicians. Men who had spent their civilian lives painting billboards, designing window displays, or working in Hollywood studios were suddenly issued uniforms and sent to Europe. The idea came from British deception operations in North Africa, where inflatable tanks and dummy positions had successfully fooled German reconnaissance. American planners saw the potential and expanded it. They wanted a mobile unit that could stage entire divisions on demand, complete with fake camps, bogus radio traffic, and visual props, convincing enough to draw enemy fire away from real troops. Imagine being one of those recruits. You're 23 years old, fresh out of art school, and you've just been told your job in the war is to blow up rubber tanks and pretend to be a general. You don't carry a rifle into battle. You carry an air pump. Your weapon isn't a machine gun, it's a paintbrush and a 500-pound speaker. One Ghost Army veteran, Bill Blass, who would later become a famous fashion designer, recalled in an interview decades later, "We were told, your job is to be seen and not be real. It sounded absurd, but we believed it might just work." The unit was organized into 4 specialized companies. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled visual deception, inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, fake aircraft. The 3132nd Signal Service Company created false radio networks, broadcasting fake messages to simulate entire divisions on the move. The Signal Company Special also used sonic deception, massive speakers mounted on half-tracks that could project recorded sounds of tanks, troops, and bridge-building operations up to 15 miles away. And the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and logistical support because even a fake army needs real protection. By June 1944, the Ghost Army landed in France. They had about 100 men, dozens of inflatable tanks and artillery pieces, and a mission that seemed impossible: make the Germans believe they were facing forces 10 times larger than what actually existed. Rubber tanks and painted lies. The equipment was ingenious. Inflatable tanks were made of rubberized canvas stretched over internal frames. Fully inflated, they looked, from a distance or from the air, exactly like real M4 Sherman tanks. They even had painted track marks, mud stains, and weathering to add realism. But they weighed only about 100 pounds. 2 men could carry one. A team could set up an entire armored battalion in a few hours. Dummy artillery was built the same way. Lightweight frames covered in painted canvas, positioned in carefully arranged patterns to mimic real gun emplacements. Fake reconnaissance planes, plywood shells shaped like Piper Cubs, were parked near airstrips to suggest air support, but visual deception alone wasn't enough. The Ghost Army had to make their illusions move, sound, and behave like real units. That's where the sonic deception came in. The Signal Company Special had developed a library of pre-recorded sounds: tanks starting up, convoy movements, bridge construction, even the clanking of mess kits and the chatter of soldiers. These recordings were played through enormous speakers, each one weighing 500 pounds and capable of projecting sound for miles. The speakers were mounted on half-tracks and driven to positions near the front lines, usually at night, where they would blast these sounds toward German listening posts. One Ghost Army officer described the effect: "You'd hear it yourself and think, that's a whole armored division moving up." and you knew it was just a phonograph and some speakers sitting in a field. Radio deception completed the illusion. Operators from the 3132nd Signal Service Company would mimic the radio traffic of real divisions, using the correct call signs, encryption patterns, and message formats. German intelligence units monitoring Allied communications would intercept these signals and report back. A new division had arrived, a major offensive was being prepared. It was theater, deadly, precise, and astonishingly effective. Operation Viersen, illusions under fire. One of the Ghost Army's most critical missions came in March 1945, during the crossing of the Rhine River near the German town of Viersen. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to launch a major assault across the river, a moment of extreme vulnerability. If the Germans concentrated their forces at the real crossing point, casualties would be catastrophic. The Ghost Army was ordered to stage a fake buildup 10 miles south of the actual crossing site. Their job? Convince the Germans that the main attack would come from there. For 3 days and nights, the Ghost Army worked. They inflated entire tank battalions. They positioned dummy artillery in open fields where German scouts could see them. They broadcast the sounds of bridge-building operations and heavy equipment movements, and they flooded the radio waves with fake traffic, simulating the communications of 2 full divisions preparing for an assault. German reconnaissance flights photographed the fake positions. German listening posts recorded the sounds. German intelligence analyzed the radio signals. And German commanders took the bait. They shifted artillery, repositioned troops, and prepared defenses at the fake crossing point. When the real assault came, 10 miles north, German resistance was lighter than expected. Thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the Rhine with fewer casualties than anticipated. The Ghost Army had done its job, but there was a cost. The closer the Ghost Army operated to the front lines, the more danger they faced. During Operation Viersen, German patrols came within a few hundred yards of the fake positions. If they had gotten close enough to realize the tanks were inflatable, the entire deception would have collapsed, and the Ghost Army soldiers, lightly armed and exposed, would have been slaughtered. One veteran, Jack Macy, later recalled the tension. "We were artists playing at war, but the bullets were real. If the Germans had figured it out while we were there, we wouldn't have made it home." Close calls and courage without guns. The Ghost Army operated on the edge of disaster constantly. Their missions required them to set up fake positions within sight and sound of enemy lines, close enough to be convincing but dangerously exposed if the deception failed. In one operation near the Luxembourg border, the Ghost Army staged a fake armored division to cover the withdrawal of a real unit. They inflated tanks, set up dummy camps, and played recordings of engine noise all night. At dawn, a German patrol approached. The Ghost Army soldiers, most of them armed with nothing heavier than a carbine, crouched behind their rubber tanks, hoping the illusion would hold. The German patrol stopped about 300 yards away, observed through binoculars, and then withdrew. They had seen what they expected to see, an American armored unit. They reported it to their commanders, and the real American troops escaped undetected, but not every close call ended so smoothly. In another instance, German artillery opened fire on a fake position. Shells landed among the inflatable tanks, shredding them into tatters. The Ghost Army soldiers dove for cover, pinned down by fire intended for an army that didn't exist. When the shelling stopped, they crept back out, patched up the surviving dummies, and kept the illusion going. Think about the psychology of that. You're lying in a foxhole while artillery rains down around you, and your tank is a balloon. You have no heavy weapons to fire back. Your only defense is the hope that the enemy keeps believing the lie long enough for you to get out alive. One Ghost Army soldier wrote in his diary, "We're not heroes. We're just guys with paintbrushes trying not to get killed for pretending to be somebody else." But that was heroism too, a different kind, quieter and stranger, but no less real. The secret stays buried. When the war ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army packed up their rubber tanks and went home. They were sworn to secrecy. Their missions, their methods, and even the existence of the unit were classified top secret. The official reason, the techniques they had developed, might be useful in future conflicts. The Army didn't want potential enemies to know exactly how American deception operations worked. So the men of the Ghost Army went back to their civilian lives and said nothing. Bill Blass became a fashion icon. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most celebrated painters of the 20th century. Arthur Singer illustrated wildlife guides. Dozens of others returned to advertising, design, engineering, and art, and never told anyone what they had really done in the war. For over 40 years, the Ghost Army remained a secret. Family members didn't know, historians didn't know, the men themselves rarely spoke about it, even to each other. It wasn't until '96, more than 50 years after the war, that the Army finally declassified the Ghost Army's records. Only then did the full story begin to emerge. Researchers discovered operation logs, photographs, and reports detailing over 20 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They interviewed surviving veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, who could finally talk openly about what they had done. One veteran, speaking publicly for the first time at a reunion in the 2000s, said, "For 50 years I couldn't tell my wife what I really did in the war. When the records were declassified, I showed her the photos, the rubber tanks, the speakers, the fake camps. She looked at me and said, 'You're telling me you spent the war in a traveling theater company?' And I said, 'Yeah, pretty much.'" Recognition, finally. In 2013, nearly 70 years after the war, the surviving members of the Ghost Army were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. By then, fewer than a dozen of the original 1,100 men were still alive. The recognition was bittersweet. Most of the men who had risked their lives with nothing but illusions were gone. They had died without parades, without medals, without their story being told. But for those who lived long enough to see it, the acknowledgement mattered. Not because they sought glory, most of them were deeply humble about what they had done, but because it meant their work was finally understood. The lives they had saved, the battles they had shaped, the quiet courage they had shown, it was real, and it was remembered. One of the last surviving Ghost Army veterans, speaking at the medal ceremony, said, "We didn't fire a shot, we didn't storm a beach, but we were there, and what we did, painting, pretending, playing sounds in the dark, it mattered. I'm glad people know that now." The strange courage of illusion. There's something deeply unsettling about the Ghost Army's story. War, we're taught, is about strength, firepower, and bravery in the face of the enemy. The Ghost Army had almost none of that. They had rubber and paint. They had recordings and radio tricks. They had creativity and nerve. And yet they saved lives. Thousands of them. Think about what that means. Think about the strange, quiet courage it takes to walk toward the enemy with nothing but a lie to protect you. To set up a fake tank in a field, knowing German artillery might open fire at any moment. To broadcast fake radio signals, knowing that if the enemy figures it out, you're exposed and defenseless. The men of the Ghost Army didn't fight the way we imagine soldiers fight. They didn't charge machine gun nests or hold bunkers under fire, but they stood in harm's way just the same, armed only with the hope that their illusions would hold long enough to matter. In a war defined by industrial slaughter, by tanks and bombs and overwhelming force, the Ghost Army proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't steel, it's belief. If you can make the enemy believe something that isn't true, you can move entire armies, shift the course of battles, and save lives without firing a shot. But there's a cost to that too. The men of the Ghost Army lived with the knowledge that their survival depended on deception, not just deceiving the enemy, but living inside a lie themselves. They weren't the divisions they pretended to be. They weren't the armored battalions painted on canvas. They were artists and ad men, playing a role, hoping the curtain didn't fall too soon. One veteran, reflecting on his service decades later, said, "People ask me if I was scared. Of course I was scared. But the scariest part wasn't the Germans. It was knowing that everything, our safety, our mission, our lives, depended on them believing something that wasn't real. And every time we set up, I thought, what if this time they don't believe it? What they left behind. Today, some of the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks are preserved in museums. You can see them, deflated, fragile, almost comical in their lightness. It's hard to imagine they once fooled an entire army, but they did. Again and again, across dozens of operations, the Ghost Army's illusions held. German commanders made decisions based on false information. Artillery fired at empty fields. Troops were diverted from real threats to chase phantoms. And because of that, real soldiers, men who had no idea the Ghost Army even existed, lived to go home. The Ghost Army never sought credit. They did their job, kept their silence, and disappeared into civilian life. For most of their lives, they were invisible twice over, once to the enemy and once to history. But their work endures. In the archives, in the photographs, in the fading memories of the handful of survivors still alive, and in the lesson they left behind that courage doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a man with a paintbrush, standing in a field, pretending to be an army. Closing questions and call to action. Many of you have written to tell me that the stories of secret operations and hidden heroes are the ones that stay with you the longest. The Ghost Army is one of those stories, a reminder that the war wasn't just fought with guns and bombs, but with minds, with creativity, and with quiet acts of bravery that were never meant to be seen. But I want to ask you, first, if you had been recruited into the Ghost Army, knowing the danger and the secrecy, would you have gone? Would you have trusted rubber tanks to save your life? Second, why do you think the Army kept this story classified for over 50 years? Was it operational security or something else? And third, what kind of courage do you think is harder, charging into battle with a weapon or walking toward the enemy with nothing but an illusion? Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you see courage in a different light, share this video. Subscribe. Because the stories that challenge what we think we know about war are the ones that matter most. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't force, it's belief. And the men who wielded it